Hi everyone, I'm Ratih Luhur, the founder and director of 𝗿𝗏. Today I have the pleasure of having a discussion with Tim Murray and Phil Haslett about the result of our recent election. Tim, I believe you and Phil has been working on some election modeling. Would you like to share a little bit about it?
Sure. Thanks, Ratih. So Phil and I, we've got our own consulting operation, Precision Economics, and we've recently joined it up with 𝗿𝗏. And in the lead up to the election, we developed a model designed to try to predict the outcome of the Australian federal election based on frameworks that were largely developed and used overseas, particularly in the United States. That model brings together a bunch of polls, can consider demographic information and different regions, so the national as well as the state and territory and down to the electorate level, all those different things, combine them all together to try to predict an outcome for the election, number of seats, probabilities of different outcomes and things like that. And that's kind of what we'd worked on and put quite a bit of information out in the public, particularly on LinkedIn, and had a chat with Saul and you, Ratih, as well in the lead up to the election.
At a high level, what does the outcome of the 2025 election look like?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think, as probably most people know, it's ended up to being a much more favourable outcome for the ALP than anyone really expected. Much more strongly, sort of the polls and the markets were predicting in the lead up. It's looking at the moment like the ALP will end up with some seat count in the mid-90s, probably about 94 when everything settles, or about that sort of ballpark. The LNP have done sort of pretty poorly in terms of their total seat count, so they'll probably be about in the mid-40s. The Greens look to have lost some seats, so they're probably going to be back down to about one seat, which is sort of what they had historically in the period preceding the election before the last one. And the independents are probably at about 10 or 11 or somewhere thereabouts. And our model has a few things to say on all these things.
Are you able to share if there are any interesting stories there? What happened and how did it come about, all this unexpected landslide?
Thanks, Ratih. There's a couple of interesting stories in terms of how the parties did. Tim mentioned the Greens, who did not so well in terms of their number of seats, and that's quite interesting what's kind of happened there. Their primary vote still held up in the Senate, but at the seat level, what the Greens rely on often to win seats is to win in three-party contests, where it's the Liberals, the Labor and the Greens, and they really need the Labor Party to come third and then them come second or first and then get preferences from the Labor Party. But because the Labor Party's done quite well this election, they've been jumping up into those second positions ahead of the Liberal Party, which has meant that the Labor is versing the Greens and the Liberal preferences tend to go to Labor. So that's why they've lost 3 of the seats that they got the last election. I think another interesting thing we've seen is in the independent space. So we had a teal wave last election where a lot of independent teal candidates did really well and unseated Liberal Party candidates. We've still seen teal candidates do well this election and get into the final 2 and have swings towards them, but they haven't, at this point, it doesn't look like any of them are going to succeed and get a seat, though still to be confirmed. And one has lost their seat, very likely to Zoe Daniel in Goldstein. They're still an important player in politics in Australia, but probably haven't seen the same wave continue from last time. That's another interesting thing, I think. The one independent who does look like winning is Andrew Ghee in 𝗿𝗏. And he's a former national who's become an independent, and he's then won his seat. So that's a slightly different to the teal kind of independence.
What sort of thing were you worried about in the lead up to the election?
I think I touched on this last time with Saul. We've also mentioned it a bit in our materials online. We sort of had 2 primary concerns. The first was related to data, and that's kind of what actually has happened a little bit. We were concerned that there might be a significant polling error, but based on sort of the recent history, we'd sort of been more concerned that if there was a polling error, it'd underestimate how well the LNP would do, because that's what we've seen recently in Australia. That's sort of what we've seen overseas as well, in the United States and in the UK, the sort of shy Tories type situation, as people sometimes call it in polling. But what we kind of had was the reverse, and I'll get to that in a second. Our other concern was that there might be all these independents that sort of came from nowhere and did particularly well, because it's hard to get to that through polling. And Phil sort of touched on this in his previous answer, that we didn't really have sort of this burst out of the gates of independents. We haven't had an explosion of independents claiming seats. But what we have seen is an increasing number of independents that are relevant in contests. So previously we sort of had some high-profile independents, maybe some teals against LNP people or some individual independents here and there. But now around Australia, there's quite a few electoral divisions where the contest is including either one or several independents, and the contest can have a lot more players in it. And that'll be an interesting thing to watch going forward, to see how much that continues and how live those multiple candidate scenarios are in the future, because those can be quite hard to predict and to model. On the polling miss, I think it's kind of pretty well accepted. It's been discussed a lot that the polls really did understate how well the Labor Party was looking to be doing for the most part. There were certainly some pollsters who sort of at the national level was sort of in the ballpark of getting that. Roy Morgan in particular was kind of at that level. But it's certainly the case that this was sort of a big polling miss in the direction that most people weren't expecting. And that'll affect sort of how we develop things going forward.
What can your model tell us about the outcome that we have seen?
That's a good question. So our model works, it's what's called a Bayesian model. And what that means is it can allow for all the biases, all the structures, the economy of the political system that we have. And it simulates a very large number of outcomes. And one of the things that Phil and I have been looking at recently is looking at a whole bunch of those simulated elections to try to see, of the ones that look similar to what we've got now, so the ones where the Labor Party get a really high seat count, what did our simulated elections sort of look like? How did they match reality and how did they differ? As Phil touched on earlier, it's when we look at these outcomes when the Labor Party does really, really well, it is very hard for the Greens to do well as well too, for the reasons that Phil said, as well as the fact that, practically speaking, a lot of the areas where the Greens are in contests where people care about giving Greens first preferences, those areas are often areas that the Labor Party, we get quite a few preferences as well. Sort of people in those areas care about the same sort of issues.
I have a question for Phil, actually. Were there any differences between your models or the polls at the state level?
Thanks, Ratih. Yes, there were. So at the state level, we have ranges in terms of the two-party preferred and for the parties and what those outcomes could be. And we have ranges and all the actual results of what they look to be within the ranges at the state level, less so at the national level. But that's quite interesting in terms of why that might arise, and because there aren't very many state polls that our model can draw on, and so it's it's more unsure about what's going to happen in each of the states. Whereas at the national level, there's a lot of polling, and so it becomes a little bit more sure. And so that's an interesting aspect, and something that also suggests that the model wasn't too bad at getting the state results to be within plausible ranges.
You had a chat with Saul before the election about the model. You did say that the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? So how did your model perform in the lead up to it and now the result after the 2025 federal election?
Thanks, Ratih. So I think we were quite happy with how the model performed in the end. So by the end, it predicted that there'd be a Labor majority, very small probability of Labor minority, and that's what we got, a very strong Labor majority. And I think in terms of that, we got that right.
Yes.
Like you'd mentioned that relative to the betting markets, we did kind of well. I think it's also notable that we're kind of, I like to think, probably about a week or two ahead of betting markets. So we were sort of a bit stronger, but also a bit stronger earlier. And a few people had contacted me and talked about that as the campaign was unfolding before we knew the results too.
I know that Saul was very impressed with that. He actually gone back and watched that video again. I recommend also all our audience, if interested, you can go back and watch that interview of Saul and Tim. He said to me that it's definitely worth revisiting. Well done, you two. And so what sort of thing did you observe or learn from your result that might inform you better for the next time?
In these sort of post-election periods, I think a lot of people are sort of celebrating the outcome or very interested in the outcome. People like Phil and I, it's in some senses, it's one of our hardest working times because we have to look back, see what we could do differently or adjust. So one of the things that we're sort of thinking about including is maybe a more explicit representation of undecided voters. So that might be a way that we can include some more variability in our model and some more of the missed types of people who might either have been not captured in the polls or driving some of those outcomes that we observed in reality. We'd also probably like to put more effort next time, or put more development work next time into some of our first preference and preference allocation systems, try and get that even tighter. To a large extent, as I mentioned to Saul last time, Phil and I are doing this now as part of our consulting operations is always sort of something we wanted to do, and we're proud and happy to have had the chance to do it. And how well our model has done has sort of given us a bit more of a incentive and a bit of excitement to try and do even better next time, or even in upcoming state elections. And if anybody's interested in working with us on any of that, they should reach out and contact us. We're happy to talk more about that for people as well.
Very well done. Amazing. Well, with all these big words about economic modeling, so I'm looking forward to do the economics modeling with you coming up soon. Thanks. Thank you for your time. Thanks, Phil. Thanks, team.